Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Russell, and as of today, applications are open for some benefits that were recently extended by the recent passage of Bill C2, including the Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit, as well as the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit, and you can claim some of those benefits retroactively. And as well as this, there's been some drama around the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit, because now finally news stations are starting to get the idea that we've been talking about here on the channel, that hey, even though there are new restrictions coming into place, people can't access this benefit for a number of reasons that we're going to go into today, as well as some reasons that they may actually change this legislation. So we'll get into a little bit of what they could potentially change for the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit to make it more applicable to everybody. And we'll first go through these applications that have recently opened up for the CRSB and the CRCB. But before we do, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and check out the links in the description where you can learn more about building your wealth here in Canada. And whenever you use those links, it directly supports the channel, so I appreciate it whenever you do that. But now let's switch over and take a closer look at the Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit and the Sickness Benefit, which have just been opened up. There have been some changes made here on the webpage for the CRA with this Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit. You can see the disclaimer right here saying the CRCB has been extended until May 7th, 22, and they've actually extended the amount of weeks that you can apply for this program by 2 additional weeks up to a maximum of 44. So again, like I've said previously, if you were previously maxed out, you have 2 more weeks that you can apply for, 2 more periods. And when we get into here, we can actually see that you're able to apply for a maximum again of 44 periods, but you're actually able to also apply retroactively for these periods. So because there was a delay for them to actually bring the CRCB extension into effect, if you were somebody who was affected in previous weeks, that's periods 61 to 63, and you previously weren't able to apply because you had maxed out at your 42 weeks, well, you can now apply retroactively for both of those weeks that you missed while they were leading into bringing this legislation into effect. So to reiterate, if you were someone who was deemed eligible, we're not going to go into the eligibility requirements right now. You can check out on the CRA's website what the eligibility requirements are for the CRCB. But if you were deemed eligible for period 61, 62, or 63, which are between these dates, well, then you can apply for all of those right now. And some very similar changes have been made here to the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit. You can see the same sort of guidelines here, that it's been extended until May 7th. The program lasts that long, but there's also an increase up to 6 weeks of eligibility. So if you've never applied for the program, you could potentially have 6 weeks of eligibility for this. Again, you can check out the eligibility requirements for yourself. This sickness benefit is if you need to quarantine or stay home due to the coronavirus, and that's something that actually might be actually applied for many people coming into this sort of holiday season where things are getting a little bit touch and go. But that's one thing that isn't the same for the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit, which has been causing a lot of drama as of late. If you're not familiar with it, the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit was the replacement for the Canada Recovery Benefit, but it was far more targeted, only allowing workers who had to leave work to claim this benefit, but only in the instance that their area is deemed to be in a lockdown. Now, the interesting portion of this is that many of these health jurisdictions, as well as the federal government in general, they're imposing restrictions, not lockdowns, right? You have these 50% reductions in capacity and all of these changes, and people need to be laid off from restaurants and things like this because there's just too much staff for a 50% capacity, right? But those workers aren't able to apply for the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit because their health region hasn't been officially deemed a lockdown zone, and that's something that is decided by the federal government. Let's get into a little bit more detail here, because now news stations like CBC have been starting to actually pick up this story, and if you've been following the channel, you'll know that this is an issue we kind of saw coming.
With the removal of those support programs, we expect that in the spring of 2022, we're going to see a hollowing out of the business community across Canada like we have just not seen before.
The NDP doesn't just want business support, it wants to bring back CERB.
We are clearly still wrestling with the pandemic. The time for income support is clearly not past.
But Chef Clooney says restaurants like hers need help and fast. If not, they're considering closing for the month of January.
So because of the wording of this legislation that was quickly passed before the politicians went on their winter break where there's no time in the House of Commons, because of the wording of this and the need for it to be a lockdown, not a restriction, well, businesses and individuals alike can't claim these supports that they may need when they're in these sort of 50% restriction zones. So obviously this is a big challenge, and it's interesting when we actually look here at the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit website on the CRA, a similar site that we were looking at for those previous benefits, but you can see that the disclaimer is a little bit different here. It says the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit applications are not available. The Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit will be available only if a COVID-19 lockdown region is designated, and currently there are no designated CWLB regions. But even though the House of Commons is closed for the session, there is a chance that some aspects of Bill C2 can be changed through something called regulation. I want to show you this article to give you a little bit more context. First here, we see Daniel Blakey, someone we've covered here on the channel from the NDP, who's part of the Finance Committee and is the official finance critic for the NDP, saying that I think this is one of the critical failures of the legislation that the Liberals brought to Parliament, and that it's a very restrictive income support benefit. We all know that there's still a lot of economic consequences of the pandemic, and as Omicron picks up, we're seeing an impact on business, but not necessarily because of widespread government mandated lockdowns, sort of hinting at the fact that, hey, if people are staying home of their own accord, even though there's not a government mandated lockdown, well, that can have a negative effect on business, as well as these restrictions imposed by various different municipalities and provincial governments. But even more interesting here is that they say in an email to CBC, a spokesperson for Freeland, that's Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister and deputy prime minister, that spokesperson said that they're looking at whether to adjust this support measures in response to the rise in infections and restrictions fueled by the Omicron variant. But how can that be so? How can they just willy-nilly change these bills however they see fit? Well, they can't change every aspect of them, but there are certain things that they can change, and that's actually written into the legislation via something called regulations. Legislation, you have to pass it through the House of Commons, you have to make all these changes over a long amount of time, but regulation is something that's actually written into that legislation that allows for certain parameters and certain changes to be made without the authority of passing it through the entire House of Commons. So let's take a closer look at Bill C2 itself and find out, hey, if they were going to change something, what do they even have the power to change? And in this regulations section of Bill C2, there are two key points that they can change very easily that could have dramatic effects on how many people are able to access the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit, and that's point A and point B. The first one is to amend the definition of lockdown order in section 2. So the government of Canada is able to change whenever they want to whatever they want the definition of what a lockdown order is, which is one of the requirements for your area to be able to receive the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit. So if they change lockdown from this sort of broad, complete shutdown of businesses to maybe a 50% capacity reduction, well, then that would be an instance where potentially the businesses would be able to apply for more supports, as well as individuals who are affected by this, even though the zone wasn't in a lockdown via the previous definition. Now, the second thing here is to fix a lower number of days for the purpose of subsection 3, bracket 2. This is in reference to the eligibility requirement for the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit that makes it so that you can't start to actually give out these benefits until you've had 2 weeks under a lockdown. Now, given the current sentiment in the country, I think it would be very unpopular in many jurisdictions for them to do a full entire lockdown for 2 weeks plus, which is the only current way that someone could receive the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit, because they need to have a minimum of 14 days under lockdown to apply for it. So there are all these very, very tight restrictions on who can apply for the worker lockdown benefit, but at least in the case of these two, the definition of the lockdown order, as well as the amount of days you need to be under lockdown to receive this benefit, well, those things could be changed, and based on that statement in the CBC article, this is something that it seems like the finance, or the Department of Finance is at least thinking about. But on the flip side, these tighter guidelines as to who's actually able to access these pandemic benefits, well, that's something that was planned by the Liberals. They have made many comments saying that they wanted to go from these broader supports that can actually be applied to for many people to these more narrow ones that only unique situations will be able to apply to. Chrystia Freeland, when she was in front of the Finance Committee, said herself that she hopes that nobody will have to apply for the Canada Worker Lockdown benefit, and it should be a sort of last resort. It seems like the Liberals are really trying to transition from this more broad support, largely due to these concerns that have been pressed on them by the Conservatives that they're spending too much in this pandemic, and as a result, that spending is sort of finding its way into the economy and increasing the cost of living via inflation. So there are pros and cons to each side of this, but it's definitely a complex situation. And I know we got into the weeds a little bit more than usual on this episode, but I hope this has cleared things up for you, both in terms of where we are, what can be changed, and where we could potentially go. So hopefully that's helpful. Let me know what you think of it down in the comments. I read every single one and try to get back to as many as I possibly can. And while you're down there, subscribe to the channel and check out those links in the description. If there's anything you're interested in there, when you use those links, it directly supports this channel, so I appreciate that. But with all of that said, thanks so much for watching, everyone. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.